Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Dog walking seems simple. Just you, the leash, and a quiet stroll through the neighborhood. But when the streets are empty and the dogs start growling at nothing, you realize you're not alone out there. I used to walk the trail behind our neighborhood almost every evening. It wasn't a formal park, just a dirt path that looped through a wooded greenbelt on the edge of southwest Portland. The trees were tall and close together, mostly Douglas firs, with patches of ivy and blackberry bushes that had taken over the ground. There were no lights or fencing. It was quiet, and that's what I liked about it. It was the kind of place where the air always smelled damp and green, even in summer. That spring in 2017, I was walking with my two golden retrievers, Murphy and Rhea. They were both big, gentle dogs, the kind that wagged at strangers, tolerated everything, and never caused trouble on walks. They had never given me a reason to be nervous. We'd been walking that same route for months, sometimes years, without anything unusual ever happening. It was around 6:30 in the evening. The sun was dropping but not gone, and the woods were shaded in that way they always are near dusk, cool and muted, but not dark. The dogs were steady on their leashes, neither pulling nor lagging. We had gone maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the loop, reaching a place where the trail curved sharply to the left, near a patch of trees that leaned inward. That part of the trail always felt a little tighter, a little more closed off. Just before we reached the curve, Murphy stopped walking. He didn't slow down. He came to a complete halt. His front paws planted firmly in the dirt, his body stiff. Rhea immediately mirrored him, standing still with her ears slightly back, and her body pressed in close to my leg. Murphy's tail lowered, and his posture dropped slightly. Then he growled, slowly and deliberately, from deep in his chest. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It sounded more like a warning, measured, restrained, and entirely unfamiliar. He had never growled like that before, not at other dogs, not at passing cars, not even at the occasional deer. I followed their gaze toward the trail ahead. At first, I didn't see anything. The path was partially hidden around the bend, and the space just beyond it was darker than where we stood. I kept looking. Then I noticed something behind a tree on the far side of the curve. It was a shape, too still and too structured to be a fallen branch or a clump of undergrowth. There was a man crouched behind the trunk of a large fir tree. His body was low to the ground, almost hidden entirely by the shape of the trunk and the vines growing up around it. He was dressed in black, loose-fitting clothes, heavy layers. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt, which was pulled forward in a way that cast his features in shadow. Even from that distance, I could tell he wasn't moving. He remained completely still, and he was watching us. He wasn't startled when I saw him. He didn't step back or make a motion to show he hadn't meant to scare anyone. He didn't try to wave or offer any indication that he was there for an innocent reason. His head was tilted slightly forward, and his eyes remained fixed on us. The posture wasn't confused or shy. It was deliberate. It was too still, too controlled, and it made something inside my chest tighten in the way I couldn't explain at first. For a moment I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no obvious reason for anyone to be crouching in that spot, just off the trail. He wasn't tying his shoe. He wasn't sitting. He wasn't resting. He looked like someone who had positioned himself there intentionally and had been waiting quietly for something, or for someone, to arrive. I didn't say anything. I didn't make any noise at all. My hand went to my phone and I pulled it from my pocket. I didn't unlock it. I didn't raise it fully. I just held it out in the open, as if showing that I had it would be enough to change whatever was happening. That was when the man began to move. He didn't turn and run. He didn't stumble backward or disappear quickly into the brush. He stood up slowly, shifting his weight just enough to straighten part way. Then he took 2 steps backward, moving deeper into the trees. His eyes remained locked on mine as he backed away, his expression completely neutral. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. And then he was gone, absorbed into the undergrowth and the shadows behind the tree line. As soon as he disappeared, I turned around and started walking. The dogs followed without hesitation. I didn't look back. My pace quickened almost immediately. And then I was jogging, then running. The leashes stayed tight in my grip as the dogs kept close to my side. I didn't hear any movement behind us. No snapping branches, no breathing, no sounds of pursuit. But my body stayed tense until we were back at the neighborhood sidewalk. Once we reached the residential streets, I slowed down, though my heart was still pounding in my chest. I remember seeing a man a few houses down, retrieving his garbage bins from the curb. He looked at me briefly, probably noticed something in my face or posture, but I didn't speak. I kept walking until I reached my front door. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain into place, then sat down on the floor with both dogs still leashed beside me. My hands were shaking. I called the non-emergency police line about an hour later, once I had calmed down enough to speak clearly. I explained what I saw in as much detail as I could. The man's clothing, his position behind the tree, the way he had watched me without flinching, the way he backed into the trees as if he had no reason to hurry. A police officer called me back that same night to ask for a more formal statement. During the conversation, he mentioned something that made everything feel worse. He told me that another woman had been attacked in that same wooded area the previous evening. She had also been walking her dog, and she had described a man who emerged from the trees without warning. He had grabbed her and tried to drag her off the path. Her dog had fought back, biting him hard enough to break the skin and force him to let go. She had escaped. She was alive, but she had been hurt. Her description of the attacker matched the man I had seen almost exactly. Black clothing, hood pulled low, lurking off the trail behind the trees. It was only by chance that I had walked that same path just 24 hours later. The officer's tone changed slightly once he realized how close the timing had been. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept playing the moment over and over in my mind. The sudden stop from Murphy, the way Cyrus leaned in against my leg, the stillness of that man's posture, and the way he had never once looked away. It didn't feel like I had narrowly missed something bad. It felt like I had walked directly to the edge of it and stood staring in. I never went back to that trail. From that day on, I started loading the dogs into the car and driving across town to a large park where the paths were wide and open and there were always other people nearby. For a while, I kept checking local news and neighborhood forums for updates, but nothing ever came of it. The man was never identified. No arrests were made. A few signs were posted near the trail entrance, warning of recent suspicious activity. But they were vague and temporary. Eventually, they were taken down. Even though nothing more happened, I never really let go of that night. The memory stayed with me, clear and uncomfortable. I remembered the sound of Murphy's growl more than anything else. It was the only warning I had. If the dogs hadn't reacted the way they did, if I had kept walking around that corner without pausing, then I would have stepped directly into whatever that man had been waiting for. There would have been no time to back up, no chance to hesitate, no buffer between that silence and something far more dangerous. People have said to me, again and again, that dogs sense things people can't, that they see danger for what it is, long before we do. After that night, I believe it without question. The reason I was able to come home safely that evening had nothing to do with instinct or luck. It had everything to do with those two animals who refused to take another step forward. They saw what I couldn't. They stopped me before it was too late. I had developed a habit over the years of walking my 3 dogs through High Park in the early morning hours, usually around 6 or 6:30. It wasn't just a matter of convenience. I found something comforting about moving through the park while most of the city was still asleep. The air always seemed cooler, cleaner somehow, and the sounds of traffic hadn't yet crept into the edges of the forested trails. During those walks, it felt like I had the entire place to myself. The only things I usually heard were the low crunch of my boots on gravel and the rustling movements of squirrels in the brush. On that particular morning, sometime in late September of 2014, the air was damp with dew, and a layer of pale mist still hung low in the trees. The sky had just begun to brighten, though the sun had not yet fully broken the horizon. I remember the way the light filtered on through the thinning leaves overhead, casting a pale golden hue across the path ahead of me. Sorry. Most of the trees had started to change by then. Some leaves had already fallen and clung to the damp ground in clusters that clung to my boots as I walked. The dogs had been especially calm that morning. Charlie, my aging golden retriever, trotted beside me with his usual patient stride, stopping occasionally to sniff patches of grass or fallen bark. Lucy, the basset hound, moved more slowly as she always did, with her low body and dragging paws making soft, rhythmic sounds in the dirt. Max, the youngest of the 3 and by far the most energetic, darted ahead and back again in wide circles, his tiny legs moving with frantic speed and his ears bouncing as he ran. He never strayed far, though. That morning, like every other, he stayed within sight and returned quickly whenever I called. As we moved farther into the wooded area, just past one of the faded green trail markers near the base of a hill, the dogs suddenly froze. All 3 of them, even Max, stopped walking at the exact same moment. Their bodies stiffened, their ears lifted high, and their heads turned sharply to the left, toward a small dip in the terrain where the trees grew thicker and the underbrush was heavier. I didn't hear anything at first, but the change in their posture was too sudden to ignore. They weren't showing curiosity or excitement. They appeared completely alert, and their stillness made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could process what was happening, Max took off running. His bark echoed sharply through the trees as he sprinted down the embankment, pushing through the dense brush with alarming speed. His voice had changed as well. It had lost its usual yipping quality and now sounded higher, more frantic, like he was responding to something threatening rather than reacting with playful energy. I tightened my grip on the leashes and called out after him, though my voice came out shakier than I'd expected. Charlie began to pull against the leash, while Lucy took a hesitant step backward. I I struggled to keep my footing on the slope as I followed the direction Max had gone, stumbling slightly as the terrain shifted beneath me and the smell of wet leaves and soil grew stronger. At the bottom of the slope, tucked behind a curtain of overgrown ivy and half submerged under layers of dead foliage, there was a rusted storm drain embedded in the base of a brick retaining wall. I had passed it many times before over the years, but had never paid it any attention. It was about 4 feet tall, round, and deeply rusted along its edges, with streaks of brown and orange running down the brickwork surrounding it. The opening was nearly swallowed by shadow. Even with the faint morning light filtering through the trees, I couldn't see more than a few feet into it. The darkness inside seemed unnaturally thick, almost as if the light itself refused to pass through the entrance. Max stood directly in front of the tunnel, with his front paws in the mud, barking continuously into the void ahead of him. His tail was rigid and pointed downward, and his body was angled low, like he was ready to lunge forward or retreat at any second. His barks came in short, rapid bursts, filled with something I couldn't quite place, something that made my chest feel tight and my breath slow in my throat. He wasn't just being reactive. He was trying to push something back. As I moved closer, I kept my eyes on the tunnel's mouth. I don't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe another animal, with a glint of someone hiding inside. But there was nothing. There was only that still, black opening. Then, just beneath the sound of Max's barking, I began to hear something else. At first, I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all. It was soft, faint enough that I thought it might have been carried by the wind or caused by the echo of the dogs. But as I stepped closer, the sound became more distinct. It was a voice, very quiet, barely audible, and oddly high-pitched. It sounded like it might have belonged to a child, though the tone didn't carry any warmth or urgency. The words themselves were unintelligible, more like fragmented syllables spoken with uneven rhythm, as if the speaker didn't fully understand the language they were using. The sound came from deep within the tunnel, far beyond where I could see. I stood completely still. I didn't speak. I didn't call out. I only listened. The whispering continued for several seconds, repeating the same broken cadence again and again. Then it stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, as if the air itself had grown denser and was pressing in on my ears. There was no movement, no sound from birds or leaves or distant footsteps. The forest around us felt sealed off, like the world had closed around that one moment. That was when the laughter began. It started low, so faint I almost mistook it for a cough. But the sound deepened rapidly, shifting in pitch and texture in a way that made my stomach turn. It no longer resembled anything childlike. It was guttural and uneven, as though it came from a throat filled with water or broken glass. It echoed inside the tunnel with a kind of loose rhythm, growing louder, not in volume but in presence, as if the source of it were moving closer without physically approaching. It didn't sound joyful. It didn't sound human. It sounded like something trying to sound human and failing completely. I didn't hesitate. I rushed forward, scooped Max into my arms, and turned sharply away from the tunnel. Charlie and Lucy resisted briefly, but the pull on the leash got them moving. I climbed the slope with unsteady steps, nearly slipping once as the weight of the dogs dragged against me. I didn't look back. I didn't listen for the sound again. I focused only on the path ahead, on getting back to the open trail, where the trees thinned and other people occasionally passed through. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head. barking, the voice, the laughter. None of it made sense. The following morning, I reported the incident to the park office. I didn't expect them to find anything, but I felt that someone should at least look. 2 staff members went to inspect the area and returned later that day. They told me the same thing both of them had already known before they even arrived. The tunnel had completely collapsed less than 20 feet inside. The entire passage was blocked by rusted sheet metal, packed soil, and debris from decades of erosion. There was no space to move beyond the entrance, and the back end of the pipe, which used to drain into a fenced-off ravine on the opposite side of the hill, had been sealed off years earlier. A few days after that, I mentioned the encounter to a woman who had lived in the area since the 1970s. When I described the tunnel and the location, her face changed immediately. She told me, in a low voice, that she remembered a case from her teenage years involving a missing boy whose body had been found in one of the old drainage culverts in the park. No suspect had ever been arrested, and the cause of death had never been made public. The tunnel had been partially filled in not long after. According to her, local children had always been afraid of that particular spot. There were stories about voices coming from the dark, about shadows that didn't belong, about people hearing laughter when no one was around. I never returned to that part of the park again. Even after the dogs passed away and my routines changed entirely, I avoided the Western Trail. I moved to a different neighborhood a year later and stopped visiting High Park altogether. Max, until the end of his life, refused to approach anything that resembled a tunnel or drainage pipe. If I tried to walk him near an underpass or even a large sewer grate, he would stop abruptly, lower his head, and whimper until I turned around. To this day, I don't understand what I heard that morning. I only know that it wasn't imagined. It wasn't a trick of the wind or a misheard echo. I heard something that didn't belong, something that used a voice that didn't fit, something that laughed in a way that still echoes in my memory when everything around me is silent. I remember the sound clearly, not because it was loud, but because of the way it stayed. I had been walking dogs professionally for a few years by the time that incident happened. And by then, I'd become familiar with most of the neighborhoods tucked between the main roads of Tampa, especially the older, quieter ones, where the homes sat low to the ground, and the yards were mostly shaded by mature trees with heavy limbs draped in Spanish moss. The family on Marigold Lane had hired me on a regular schedule for nearly 2 years, and their house, a single-story structure, painted a dull yellow with chipping trim, never struck me as unusual. Their 3 small dogs were always high energy but manageable, and my routine there was predictable. Enter through the back gate, unlock the sliding kitchen door with the spare key hidden under the ceramic frog, leash the dogs, and take them on their usual walk around the block. That house had never felt unsafe or particularly strange until one afternoon when everything I thought I knew about the place shifted completely. That day was no different from any other in terms of weather or timing. The Florida sun was still high overhead when I pulled up and parked along the curb. The heat had been rising off the asphalt in visible waves, and the air was thick with humidity, which pressed against my skin as soon as I stepped out of the car. I unlatched the wooden gate and crossed the backyard like always, hearing no sounds beyond the familiar rustle of palm fronds and the distant murmur of lawnmowers a few streets away. When I unlocked the sliding glass door and stepped inside the kitchen, the dogs exploded into their usual barking. But this time, the noise felt different. Their voices weren't laced with excitement or impatience. Instead, their barks were sharp, panicked, and oddly continuous, without any of the rise and fall that usually accompanied their greetings. All 3 dogs had crowded together in the far corner of the kitchen, just beyond the edge of the linoleum, where the floor vent was set into the hardwood beneath the small breakfast nook. The terrier had positioned himself low to the ground, paws extended forward, and he was digging at the metal grate with such violent force that his nails created a constant metallic scraping sound. The 2 Shih Tzus barked incessantly, their bodies tense and their eyes wide, pacing in tight, erratic circles behind him. I had seen dogs react strongly to unfamiliar sounds before, especially in older homes where wildlife sometimes found its way into crawl spaces or attics. So I initially assumed that some animal, a raccoon, a possum, or maybe a large rat, had found its way beneath the floor. But something about their reaction caused a deep unease to settle in my stomach. They weren't just reacting to noise or scent. They seemed entirely fixated on whatever was directly beneath that vent, and the intensity in their posture made it clear that they weren't simply alarmed. They were terrified. I walked slowly across the kitchen, each step echoing slightly on the old tiles, and I knelt down just a few feet from where the dogs continued to bark with unwavering focus. At first, I didn't hear anything beyond their commotion, but when I leaned in slightly, holding my breath so I could listen more closely, I caught the faintest noise rising from beneath the floorboards. It was not the frantic scratching of claws or the soft rustling of fur brushing against wood. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving slowly across a dirt surface. Something dragging its weight inch by inch through the enclosed space beneath the house. Then came the breathing. What I heard was not the erratic panting of a frightened animal, but slow, steady, deliberate breaths. Each inhale drawn through a human throat, followed by a low exhale that made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. I stood up immediately, every part of my body filled with a sensation that felt like static buzzing beneath my skin, and I backed away from the vent without taking my eyes off it. The dogs continued to bark, and their alarm only seemed to grow louder with my movement. I guided them out the back door without even clipping on their leashes, driven by the overwhelming instinct to put some distance between myself and the source of that breathing. Once outside, I shut the door firmly behind us and moved into the middle of the yard with my phone already in hand, my heart still pounding in my chest. I did not try to investigate the vent or attempt to speak through it. I did not try to rationalize what I had heard or tell myself it could have been anything else. I knew what I had heard, and I knew it had come from a person. The homeowners arrived not long after I contacted them. They looked concerned the moment they pulled into the driveway and stepped out of their car. And once inside, they quickly began moving through the house, checking rooms and listening for any sounds. I stayed outside with the dogs, pacing slowly along the fence line and glancing at the house every few seconds, half expecting someone to emerge from beneath the crawl space opening. The breathing had stopped by then, or at least I could no longer hear it. The vent looked the same as it always had, undisturbed and dusty. The police were called shortly after the homeowners finished checking the interior of the house. When the officers arrived, they walked the perimeter carefully and spent several minutes examining the base of the house where the crawl space vents were set into the foundation. Eventually, they found one that had been tampered with. It was on the far side of the property, mostly hidden behind a row of untrimmed hedges. The metal grate had been pried loose and bent inward, and the surrounding ground was littered with scuffed dirt and smeared handprints pressed into the soil. One of the officers knelt down, turned on his flashlight, and crawled into the dark opening while the others remained nearby. The moments that followed felt stretched and strange, as though time itself had slowed. I could hear the shifting of gravel and the dull thump of movement beneath the house. Then the officer called out, and a second later, another figure emerged from the crawl space behind him. The man who came out was filthy. His skin was coated in a thin layer of dust and grease. His hair was matted to his scalp, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame as though they hadn't been changed in days. In one hand, he clutched a black-handled knife, his grip tight but trembling. In the other, he held a worn nylon backpack streaked with mud. He didn't resist the officers who surrounded him. He didn't speak or make any sudden movements. He just stood there in the shadow of the house, blinking up at the fading sunlight, like he had forgotten what daylight even looked like. When they searched the contents of his backpack, they found only a few items: a half-empty bottle of water, 2 granola bars wrapped in foil, a small towel stained with dirt, and a Ziploc bag containing a folded stack of photographs. The police didn't show the images to me directly, but later that evening, the homeowner told me exactly what had been found inside. The photographs included multiple pictures of the house taken from a distance, as though someone had been watching it from across the street for several days. There were photos of the dogs as well, captured through the gaps in the backyard fence or through windows. And there were several photos of me. One showed me standing in the kitchen near the sink. Another was taken through the sliding door as I crouched near the floor vent, likely only a few feet above where the man had been hiding at the time. The final photo was perhaps the most disturbing. It had been taken just as I was locking the door after a walk. My face turned slightly, my posture relaxed, entirely unaware that someone had been close enough to capture that image from the shadows outside. The police concluded that he had been living beneath the house for at least several days, using the broken vent as a point of entry and exit during the night. They believed he had been sneaking in after dark, sleeping beneath the house during the day, and surviving on what little food and water he had brought with him, while the family had been going about their lives inside, eating dinner, watching television, or sleeping in their bedrooms. He had been curled up in the dirt and darkness beneath their floorboards, listening to every sound they made. I never returned to that house after that day. I let the homeowners know I would no longer be available, and I quietly adjusted my schedule to exclude any homes with open crawl spaces or unsecured foundations. Even now, when I enter an unfamiliar property and hear dogs barking at something beneath the floor or pacing near a vent, I feel that same pulse of unease stir in my chest. I never forgot the sound of that slow, deliberate breathing beneath my feet. It was calm, patient, and too close, far closer than anyone should ever be without your knowledge. During the autumn of 2014, I was living just south of Black Forest, Colorado, renting the lower level of a quiet home that stood at the edge of a tree-covered slope where cell service faded and voices echoed strangely between the trees. Even in daylight, the forest carried a stillness that made footsteps feel too loud. After dusk, the quiet became so complete that it pressed against the windows, making even the creak of the house settle like a warning. At the time, I was finishing my final year of college and picking up part-time work wherever I could. tutoring, overnight shifts, anything that fit between classes. That's how I ended up getting to know Kelly Murrow. She was also a student, slightly younger than me, working towards certification in veterinary tech and walking dogs on the side to cover her expenses. Although we weren't especially close, we shared enough overlapping acquaintances and late-night campus study sessions that I came to know her as dependable and sharp. Someone who carried herself with a calm confidence that people noticed and leaned on. Kelly had been walking dogs professionally for nearly a year, and over time had built a roster of clients who trusted her not just with their animals, but with their homes and routines. One of those clients was a retired officer who owned an older German shepherd named Bruno. The dog had once served on a K-9 unit, but now lived a much quieter life on the outskirts of the town, where his owner had moved to live alone in a home bordering miles of pine forest. Bruno was large and weathered, with graying fur around his eyes and a broad frame that still carried the weight of discipline, though his joints had stiffened with age. Kelly adored him and often took him on longer walks through the woods, claiming the quiet seemed to suit him. Hemlock Trail was a path most people avoided. It wasn't marked in any official capacity and didn't appear on any park brochures or hiking apps. Instead, it twisted between neglected property lines and older homesteads long reclaimed by underbrush and time. The trail itself had no true start or end, just a series of winding forks, narrow ridgelines, and worn wooden markers that had lost their paint to years of snow and sap. Even seasoned hikers mentioned how the trail could turn disorienting without warning. There were parts where the ground dipped unexpectedly or where tree limbs reached low enough to catch a hood or sleeve. Many of us who lived nearby had experienced strange, localized dead zones where phones lost signal and GPS maps stopped responding altogether. Kelly had walked Hemlock Trail with Bruno multiple times. She often preferred the solitude, especially in the cooler months when the mosquitoes had died off, and the pine needles underfoot softened each step into a quiet glide. On October 12th, around 5:30 in the evening, she sent a message to one of her friends, mentioning that she was taking Bruno out for a short loop along the trail and planned to be back before 7. The air had been colder than usual that evening, the kind of early fall chill that settled quickly once the light faded. It was already growing dark when she set out, but she had taken that path so often that no one thought to question her choice. A neighbor's security camera caught a final glimpse of her as she crossed the wooden bridge at the trail's entrance. Bruno walked beside her, tail lifted in a relaxed arc, leash extended but steady. She wore a hooded jacket, leggings, and worn-in trail shoes with thick soles caked in dried mud. There were no other hikers visible. No joggers passed by. No cars were parked along the edge of the road behind her. That footage became the last confirmed sighting of her. By just after 8 p.m., Bruno had returned alone. He was found clawing at the front door of his owner's house, teeth bared in frantic snarls between low, guttural whines. The end of his leash still hung from his collar, but the length had been severed several inches from the clasp, the torn edge frayed and soaked with saliva. His fur was matted with clumps of earth and pine needles, and his snout was streaked with fresh scratches as if he had forced his way through dense undergrowth or tunnel-like spaces. The pads of his paws were worn down to exposed skin, streaked with sap and rough grit. His behavior, according to his owner, had changed entirely. He refused to enter the back hallway of the house and kept pacing in tight, anxious circles near the front door. Calls to Kelly's phone went unanswered. The first went to voicemail after one ring. Every attempt after that failed to connect. Search and rescue teams were mobilized that night, Officers, volunteers, and neighbors gathered at the trailhead within the hour, carrying flashlights and printed satellite maps. Dogs were brought in from El Paso County, and aerial drones were deployed to cover the densely wooded sections, unreachable by foot. I joined the second search group that morning, working alongside others from town and a few fellow students who knew her. We spread out in pairs, marked our sections with tape, and called her name into every ravine and ditch along the path. There was no trace of her. No articles of clothing had been dropped or torn away. No blood was visible. No scuff marks, footprints, or broken branches suggested a direction of travel off trail. Some searchers pointed out oddly disturbed areas near the dry creek bed, patches where the topsoil had been shifted recently, as if something large had been dragged or buried. But none of them led to anything. Probing rods turned up only compacted soil. The creek itself had reduced to a trickle by that point in the season, offering no signs of debris or evidence beneath the surface. 6 days later, a hiker exploring a deeper, unmarked spur along the ridge reported something reflective caught between the exposed roots of a toppled tree. Authorities responded and recovered Kelly's phone. The device had sustained heavy impact damage. The screen was splintered across the front, and the back of the case had deep scratches, as though it had slid across rough bark or stone. One detail stood out above all others. A single handprint in dried mud pressed flat across the back of the phone. The shape was small, far smaller than any adult's, and the fingers were spaced unusually far apart. The print appeared deliberate, not accidental, and there were no other smudges, fingerprints, or skin oils on the case. Forensic technicians confirmed that the print had likely been pressed there within 24 to 48 hours of the phone being discovered. No one could determine where it had come from. In the weeks that followed, when quiet stories began to emerge from hikers who had taken the trail after dark, several of them, some unrelated to Kelly, reported hearing a woman's voice calling from the woods beyond the creek. The voice was described as distant but steady, repeating the same few words in a strained, almost mechanical tone. Some said it sounded like someone who had been yelling for a long time, too long, until the voice thinned into exhaustion. No one was able to follow it to a source. The voice always seemed to drift just ahead, always moving deeper into the brush, never allowing anyone to close the distance. A few even claimed that when they attempted to follow it, the trail itself appeared to change behind them, twisting in unfamiliar ways and leading them back to places they had already passed. 2 months after her disappearance, I returned to the trail once. It was unplanned. I had driven the back road out of habit and saw the weathered sign near the tree line. The letters had begun to peel, and the wooden post leaned at a crooked angle, as if the weight of years had bent it into fatigue. Without fully understanding why, I pulled over and left the car running. I had no flashlight and only the dim screen of my phone, but I walked down the path anyway, my boots crunching through the frost-covered needles. I moved past the first 2 forks in the trail, following the bend toward the slope where the trees crowded tighter together. That was when I heard the voice. It came from low in the ravine ahead, barely more than a whisper, but steady and unmistakably human. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone carried urgency and fatigue. It was not a scream. It was not panicked. It sounded like someone who had been calling out for hours and had begun to lose their voice entirely. The sound did not echo like it should have. Instead, it folded inward, as though it had traveled from behind something solid. I stood there motionless, my hands cold and useless at my sides, unable to call out or move forward. The voice faded slowly, not into distance, but into silence, like a tape that had been stopped mid-playback. When I turned to leave, the trail behind me felt narrower. The trees seemed closer than they had been moments earlier. I did not look back again. Over time, additional reports surfaced from others who claimed to have seen someone standing at the edge of the trail after dark. These sightings described a barefoot woman with tangled hair and clothing that hung in strips, as though worn thin by weather and time. In each account, the figure never moved. She remained perfectly still, and whenever a light was directed toward her, she vanished behind the trees without leaving footprints or rustling leaves. Kelly's case was never solved. No remains were found. No suspects were identified. The forest returned to silence, and Hemlock Trail remained unlisted on official maps. Bruno, the dog who had returned alone, developed severe behavioral changes after that night. He refused to sleep in his bed, would not enter the hallway facing the woods, and barked at doorways even when no one stood behind them. Within a year, his health declined rapidly, and he passed away. Years have passed since that October evening, but I still think about Kelly whenever I pass the turnoff to the trail. I no longer go near the woods after sunset, and I have never returned to Hemlock Trail. On cold nights, when the wind drifts through the trees outside my current apartment, there are moments when I imagine I can hear the faint strain of a voice just beyond the wall of pines, tired, distant, and waiting to be found.